In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was consumed by an impossible plague. Hundreds of people danced themselves to death in the streets, their bodies convulsing to a rhythm only they could hear. The physician sought poison in the bread. The priest proclaimed it divine punishment. But what if the deadliest contagion wasn't in their food or their souls, but in the very story they believed about their suffering? In the year of our Lord 1518, the city of Strasbourg was a creature of stone and timber, of faith and filth, groaning under the weight of a hot July sun. And in the heart of that city, the study of Dr. Anton Heller was an island of pristine order in a sea of chaos. It was a room that smelled of dried herbs, old paper, and the sharp tang of sterilized brass. Along one wall, detailed anatomical charts depicted the human body as a marvel of mechanics, a system of levers and humors that could be understood, catalogued, and, when necessary, repaired. Books on the theories of Galen and Hippocrates stood in disciplined ranks on his shelves, their spines uncracked, their wisdom absolute. Heller, a man in his 40s with a mind as sharp as his features, moved through this sanctuary with an economy of motion that bordered on ritual. He was grinding valerian root with a heavy porcelain mortar and pestle, his knuckles white with the effort. Thump, thump, swirl, thump, thump, swirl. Each movement was precise, measured against the knowledge laid bare in the Latin text open before him. A balm for heated blood, a tonic to soothe a choleric temperament. Everything had a cause, and every cause had a cure if one was diligent enough to find it. His young apprentice, Lucas, shifted nervously by the doorway, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was a good boy, but prone to flights of fancy, his mind too easily swayed by the guttural gossip of the streets. "Doctor," Lucas began, his voice barely a whisper, "there is talk in the market of strange humors." Heller didn't look up from his work. Thump, thump, swirl. "Strange how, Lucas?" "A woman, they say. She is afflicted, possessed of some fit." "A fit is a symptom, not a cause," Heller replied, his tone clipped and didactic. He added a pinch of powdered willow bark to the mixture, the pale dust settling over the dark root. "Is she febrile? Has she vomited? Is the blood thick or thin?" Lucas wrung his hands. "They just say it is unnatural, a new affliction, a fifth humor perhaps." The pestle stopped. The silence in the room was sudden and heavy. Heller slowly raised his head, his eyes fixing his apprentice with a look of profound disappointment. "There are 4 humors, Lucas. Phlegm, blood, yellow bile, black bile. They are the pillars of medicine, the language of the body. There are no more 4 humors than there are 5 seasons or 2 gods. Do not speak of street gossip as if it were diagnosis. Go and boil the lancets. Ignorance, I find, is a contagion that requires constant sterilization." Lucas bowed his head and scurried away, leaving Heller alone once more in his fortress of reason. He returned to his work, but the rhythm was broken. A 5th humor. The thought was so absurd, so offensive to the elegant, ordered world he had built around himself, that it felt like a tiny, sharp stone in his shoe. The market square was a riot of sound and smell. The cobblestones were slick with mud and offal, the air thick with the competing stenches of fresh bread, rotting vegetables, and unwashed humanity. Heller navigated the throng with a grim determination, his dark, clean coat a stark contrast to the rough-spun chaos around him. He moved like a man visiting a foreign country, observing the locals with a detached clinical curiosity. He saw a child with the telltale pallor of worms, a merchant whose florid face screamed of an excess of blood, a beggar whose rasping cough spoke of phlegm settling in the lungs. It was all familiar, all explainable. Then he heard it. Not a scream or a shout, but a change in the market's ambient roar, a pocket of silence, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. People were backing away from the central fountain. their faces a mixture of nervous laughter and wide-eyed fear. Some of the women were crossing themselves, their lips moving in silent prayer. Heller pushed his way forward, his irritation rising. He expected to find a common drunkard, a street performer, or perhaps an epileptic seized by a grand mal. Instead, he saw her. She stood alone in the cleared space, a woman of middle years named Frau Troffea. He recognized her as the wife of a candlemaker, but she was not standing still. She was dancing. There was no music. There was no joy in her expression. Her eyes were thrown wide, fixed on some point beyond the cathedral spire, beyond the sky itself. Her arms flailed, her body jerked and twisted in a series of convulsive, uncoordinated movements. It was a grotesque pantomime of merriment, a silent, frantic jig that held no rhythm and no purpose. Her feet, bare and muddy, slapped against the wet stones in a desperate, unending beat. She was a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen, malicious master. Heller felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not in his books. This was not a fit he recognized. This was a violation. A human body, his area of expertise, was behaving in a way that defied every principle he held dear. He moved closer, the physician's instinct to diagnose and to heal overriding the primal urge to turn and walk away. His rational toolkit, usually so effective, was utterly useless. He stood before Frau Troffea, close enough to see the beads of sweat on her brow, and began his examination. "Frau Troffea," he said, his voice firm and clear. "Can you hear me? My name is Dr. Heller." There was no response. Her eyes remained fixed, her jaw slack. The frantic dance continued, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He reached out and gently took her wrist. The skin was clammy, the pulse a frantic, thready drumbeat beneath his fingertips, far too rapid. He leaned in closer, checking her eyes. The pupils were wide, dark pools that did not react to the shadow of his hand passing over them. He sniffed her breath, searching for the sour tang of spirits or the bitter almond scent of certain poisons. Nothing. Only the faint acidic smell of fear and exertion. He had no data, no symptoms to cross-reference, no signs to interpret. She was a closed book, written in a language he had never seen. He released her wrist, and her arm swung back into its wild, repetitive motion. He was a master clockmaker presented with a timepiece that was melting. The crowd around them had grown, drawn by the morbid spectacle. Their whispers were a low, anxious hiss. "The devil's work," one man muttered. "God's wrath," a woman replied, clutching the crucifix around her neck. Heller scanned the faces, seeing his own scientific bewilderment reflected back as raw, superstitious terror. And then he saw him. Standing on the stone steps of the grand cathedral that overlooked the square, away from the press of the crowd, was Father Christoph. The man was a pillar of a black cloth and rigid certainty, his face grim, his eyes burning with a conviction that seemed to draw in the very sunlight. He was not looking at Heller. He was looking at the woman, but his gaze was not that of a physician. It was the look of a judge watching a sentence being carried out. Christoph did not move. He did not intervene. He simply stood, a silent, looming sentinel, watching as reason and medicine failed before his very eyes. The sun bled from the sky, and the shadows that pooled in the narrow streets of Strasbourg grew long and black. Torches were lit, their flickering orange light casting a hellish glow on the scene in the market square. Most of the city had retreated behind bolted doors, but a small, grim crowd of onlookers remained, their faces pale and haunted in the firelight. Frau Troffea was still dancing. Hours had passed, and the physical toll was horrific. Her simple dress was soaked through with sweat, clinging to her gaunt frame. Her hair was a matted, tangled mess. Her feet were raw and bloody, but still they moved, stomping and shuffling in that same relentless, agonizing rhythm. A low, guttural moan now escaped her lips with every exhalation, the only sound she made. She was a machine of flesh and bone, set in motion and now unable to stop, grinding itself down into ruin. Heller stood in the shadows of a nearby alley, a spectator to his own impotence. He had done all he could. He had gone to his books. He had consulted his charts. But there was no chapter on this, no cure for a body that had declared war upon itself. He felt a profound sense of failure, a cold dread that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the sight of such profound, incomprehensible chaos. He watched the faces of the small crowd. They were no longer curious. They were terrified. They looked at Frau Troffea not as a sick neighbor, but as an omen, a portent of some awful thing descending upon their city. It was then that he saw it. A man standing near the edge of the crowd, a burly blacksmith Heller knew by sight, began to twitch. It started subtly, a tremor in his thick shoulders. His head gave a violent jerk to the side. His foot began to tap, a fast, arrhythmic counterpoint to the womaness movements. His friends beside him took a step back. The blacksmith's eyes glazed over, his mouth fell open. He let out a low groan, and then, as if a wire inside him had snapped, his body launched forward into the cleared space. His limbs began to fly, his powerful body thrown about by the same invisible force that held Frau Troffea. He was dancing, frenzied, wild, and utterly without control. A collective gasp of pure animal terror rose from the remaining onlookers. It was a sound of dawning realization. This was not an isolated madness. This was not one woman's private affliction. It was spreading. The night had swallowed Strasbourg whole, leaving only the mad, flickering light of torches to fight against the darkness. In his study, Dr. Anton Heller was no longer an island of order. He was a man shipwrecked. Books lay open across his desk and floor, their pages rifled through as if by a gale-force wind. His coat was discarded, his sleeves rolled up, and his face was pale with the greasy sheen of exhaustion and fear. The contagion was real, and it was spreading. It must be physical, he muttered, pacing the narrow space between his desk and the bookshelves. His voice was a raw, ragged thing. It has to be. The mind does not simply break. Not like this. Not in dozens of people at once. It is an agent, a poison. Lucas, huddled by the door, watched his master with wide, frightened eyes. Heller seemed to be speaking more to the anatomical charts on the wall than to him. "Ergot," Heller said, spinning around, his eyes landing on a text describing fungal rots of rye. A flicker of hope, of fierce, desperate certainty ignited in his gaze. The rye grain. It can be afflicted by a rot, a fungus that produces a potent poison. They call it St. Anthony's fire. It causes convulsions, delusions, a burning in the limbs. It fits. The spasms, the trance-like state. It fits the pattern. He seized the idea like a drowning man seizing a piece of driftwood. It was tangible. It was scientific. Poison was a thing he could fight. It had a source, a pathway, a cure. He strode to a large map of the city tacked to the wall and snatched a piece of charcoal. "Lucas, the names," he commanded. "Give me the names of every afflicted person you know." As Lucas recited the names, Heller began to mark their homes on the map. Frau Troffea, the blacksmith, Otto, a weaver from the North Quarter, a tanner's boy from the South. His study, a place of calm reflection only a day before, was now a command center in a war he had just declared. He was no longer just a physician. He was an investigator, a hunter of an invisible enemy. He clung to the rational explanation of tainted bread because the alternative that this sickness was born of nothing, a fever of the soul as the priests might say, was an abyss of terrifying, unmappable chaos. And into that abyss, Anton Heller would not go. The dawn brought no relief, only a clearer view of the horror. The number of dancers had swelled overnight from 2 to more than 30. They were no longer confined to the market square. The affliction had bled into the surrounding streets and alleys, a creeping plague of ceaseless motion. Heller and Lucas, spent the day moving through a city gripped by a quiet, suffocating panic. Their investigation took them from the cramped, timber-framed houses of the poor to the more spacious homes of the artisans. The scenes that greeted them were always the same. A room filled with terrified family members, and in the center, a loved one lost in that same terrible dance. A daughter, a father, a husband, their bodies jerking, their eyes empty. Heller was methodical, his face a mask of clinical detachment. While Lucas questioned the weeping families, what did they eat? Where do you buy your flour? Was the bread this morning bitter? Heller would take his samples. He scraped green-black dust from the bottom of a bread box into a wax paper packet. He took a slice of a dark rye loaf from another. At each home, he performed the most terrifying act of all. He would produce a polished steel lancet, its tip sharpened to a needlepoint. Over the shrieks and protests of the family, he would take the danceress arm and make a quick, deep incision, drawing a bead of dark blood to be collected on a glass slide. He was not seen as a savior. He was a ghoul, an invader. His precise questions and sterile instruments were a cold violation of their profound, emotional terror. "Get out!" one man screamed, brandishing a fireplace poker as Heller approached his twitching son. "You bring the devil's tools into my home! You are the cause of this!" A woman shrieked that he was a demon, come to collect the souls of the afflicted, throwing a bucket of filthy water at him as he backed out of her doorway. Through it all, Heller's resolve never wavered, but a cold frustration began to build behind his eyes. He was trying to save these people from a physical ailment, and they were fighting him as if he were the disease itself. By midday, the cathedral square had become the epicenter of the city's fear. Dozens of dancers now occupied the open space before the grand church, a writhing, shuffling mass of humanity. The air was filled with the slap of bare feet on stone and the collective moan of utter exhaustion. It was here that Father Christoph chose to make his stand. He stood upon the cathedral steps, his black robes making him a figure of absolute authority. His voice, amplified by the stone facade behind him, boomed across the square, easily overpowering the sounds of the plague. A massive crowd had gathered, their faces tilted up towards him, hungry for answers. "Citizens of Strasbourg!" Christoph roared, his arms spread wide. He pointed a long, accusatory finger at the horrific spectacle of the dancers. "You are afraid. You look to your leaders, and they are silent. You look to your physicians, and they offer you no answers." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He had the crowd's complete attention. "They poke and they pry," he continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "They look for tainted grain when the taint is in your souls. They test your bread when they should be testing your faith. They are blind men searching for a fire in a house that is flooded." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "This is not a sickness of the body," Christoph thundered, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "It is a fever of the spirit. This is the hand of a wrathful God. It is a divine warning to a city that has strayed from the path of righteousness. You have given yourselves over to avarice and sin, and this," he gestured again to the dancers, "is your penance made flesh." He offered no evidence, no theory. He offered a simple, terrifying, and utterly compelling explanation. It was a story that made sense of their fear, that gave it shape and meaning. He was not a physician offering a diagnosis. He was a prophet, interpreting a sign. Late in the afternoon, Heller's study was thick with a tense, expectant silence. The samples from nearly 40 households were laid out in neat rows on his work table. The grain, the flour, the bread. Heller stood over them, waiting. His entire thesis, the very foundation of his rational approach to this crisis, rested on the results of Lucas's simple tests. If he could prove the presence of ergot, he could isolate the source, stop the consumption, and the plague would end. He would have an answer. He would have a cure. Christoph and his divine fevers would be silenced by fact. The door creaked open and Lucas entered, his face ashen. He carried a small tray of reagents and glass slides. He did not meet Heller's eyes. "Well?" Heller demanded, his voice tight. Lucas slowly, deliberately, walked to the table. He took a pinch of dust from the first sample and placed it on a slide. He added a drop of liquid. He held it to the light, then shook his head. He moved to the next sample, and the next, and the next. With each test, the silence in the room grew heavier, more suffocating. Finally, after testing the last sample, Lucas looked up, his expression one of utter defeat. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The samples are clean, all of them. There is no rot, no fungus, no ergot." The words struck Anton Heller like a physical blow. His logical framework, the carefully constructed fortress of reason he had built to hold back the chaos, crumbled to dust. Every test, every question, every painful intrusion into the lives of the afflicted, all of it had been for nothing. His theory was wrong. The evidence itself had falsified his science. He stared blankly at the clean samples. From the open window came the sounds of the city outside, the faint, rhythmic shuffling of hundreds of feet, and rising above it all, the powerful, certain voice of Father Christoph, continuing his sermon to a captive audience. Heller was left with no explanation, no path forward, only the terrifying, triumphant noise of the faith that was swallowing his city alive. The air in the city council chambers was stale, thick with the scent of beeswax and fear. Dr. Heller stood before a long oak table, a lone figure facing the 6 sternest men in Strasbourg. These were the city guild masters and chief magistrates, men whose faces were etched with the hard lines of commerce and authority. They were not philosophers, they were pragmatists, and their patience had worn thin. Heller felt 100 pairs of unseen eyes on his back. He had failed. His first duty was to admit it. "Honorable Council," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "My initial hypothesis regarding a contagion in the grain supply has been proven incorrect." A low murmur rippled through the assembled men. The burgomaster, a portly man named Ziegler, leaned forward. "Proven incorrect, Doctor? Or were you simply wrong? The scientific method requires that a theory be falsifiable," Heller countered, his voice taking on a slightly lecturing tone he couldn't suppress. "My theory was tested, and it failed the test. I have now moved to a new line of inquiry." "Another theory?" scoffed a gaunt-faced man from the Weavers' Guild. "While our city starves, the market is dead, the workshops are empty. We need a cure, not another of your academic exercises." Heller's jaw tightened. He knew he was losing them. "I believe we are facing a phenomenon of the mind, not the body, a form of choriomania, or mass psychogenic illness. An affliction spread not by a pathogen, but by suggestion, a sympathetic cascade of hysteria." He saw only blank, hostile stares. The words were foreign, abstract. He was speaking of ghosts and vapors to men who only understood gold and steel. He was trying to describe the intricate mechanics of a clock to men who only wanted to know the time. "So you are saying," Burgomaster Ziegler clarified, his voice dripping with condescension, "that after your search for poison bread has failed, you now believe this plague is imaginary." "Not imaginary," Heller insisted, his frustration boiling over. "Its effects are real, devastatingly so, but the cause is psychological. To understand it, I require more time. I must observe the afflicted, interview their families, attempt to find the root of the shared delusion." "Time!" The Weaver exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "The man asks for time, while Strasbourg burns. We have no more time for your theories, Doctor. We are out of time." Heller looked from one stone-cold face to the next. He saw no support, no curiosity, only the grim finality of their judgment. His credibility had vanished. Science had offered them only questions and uncertainty. And in a time of crisis, uncertainty was a luxury no one could afford. Moments later, the chamber doors opened again, and Father Christoph was ushered in. Where Heller had been tense and defensive, Christoph was a portrait of serene confidence. He walked to the center of the room, his black robes flowing around him, his presence immediately commanding a respect that Heller had failed to solicit. He inclined his head to the council, but did not bow. "You have heard the physician's counsel," Christoph began, his voice calm and resonant. "He offers you complexity, uncertainty, and the need for more time. He chases shadows in the mind. I am here to offer you a solution." Burgomaster Ziegler leaned forward, his eyes alight with desperate hope. "You have a cure, Father?" Christoph smiled, a thin, knowing expression. "One does not cure the will of God, Herr Burgomaster. One embraces it. This is not a sickness to be purged. It is a trial to be endured. The people dance because their souls are burning with a fever of piety, a desperate prayer to an Almighty who feels too distant. They are trying to dance their way back into His grace." The council members exchanged glances. This was a language they understood. It was the language of sin and salvation that had governed their lives since birth. "So what is your solution?" Ziegler asked. "If the dance is a prayer," Christoph declared, his voice rising with theatrical power, "then we shall help them pray. If their fever must burn, we shall give it fuel until it burns itself out. I say we clear the guild halls. We build stages in the public squares. We shall hire musicians, drummers, and pipers. We will encourage this dance day and night. We will turn this curse into a city-wide ritual of penance. Let them dance the sin from their bodies, and God, seeing our devotion, will grant us relief." The proposition was audacious, mad even, but it was a plan. It was action. It was a simple, powerful narrative that took the terrifying, chaotic phenomenon and gave it a divine purpose. While Heller had offered them a complex problem, Christoph had given them a simple, unifying task. In the face of overwhelming chaos, the illusion of control was irresistible. The council, desperate to be seen doing something, anything, latched onto the priest's solution as if it were a life raft. Heller stood in the market square, a powerless spectator to the implementation of his worst nightmare. A kind of manic energy had gripped Strasbourg. The city's guilds, under the council's decree, had thrown their resources into Christoph's plan. In the center of the square, a large, rough-hewn wooden stage had been erected. Carpenters were hammering away at another near the cloth hall. The rhythmic, pounding beat of drums echoed from the direction of the tanner's quarter. Then the musicians arrived. Not just a lone fiddler, but entire troops hired by the council. They mounted the main stage, and with a nod from a city guardsman, they began to play. It was not a somber hymn. It was a loud, relentlessly upbeat folk tune, with a driving, infectious rhythm. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The few dozen dancers who had been shuffling in the square seemed to galvanize, their movements becoming more frantic, more synchronized to the beat. But the true horror was what happened to the crowd. People on the edge of the mob, who had been watching with morbid fascination, began to twitch and jerk. Healthy citizens, caught up in the sanctioned mania and the undeniable power of the music, felt the strange compulsion take hold. Some were pushed forward by city guards, told it was their civic and spiritual duty to join. The phenomenon exploded. The number of dancers doubled in an hour. By late afternoon, it had tripled. It was no longer a contained plague. It was a city-sanctioned frenzy. Hundreds of people now thrashed and spun in the square, a swirling vortex of sweat, tears, and ecstatic agony. Heller was utterly alone, a single, silent point of reason in a world that had chosen to go gloriously, terrifyingly mad. The official narrative had become superstition. The city's cure was now the disease, and it was spreading at a terrifying speed. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, the scene in the market square devolved into a vision of hell. The music had not stopped for a moment. Hundreds upon hundreds of dancers still writhed under the torchlight, their faces masks of ecstatic exhaustion. Amidst the swirling throng, a young man, no older than Lucas, faltered. His movements became jerky, his arms flailing as his legs gave way. For a moment he fought to stay upright, his eyes wide with a flicker of horrified clarity, as if waking from a long dream only to find himself in a nightmare. Then, with a final choked gasp, he collapsed to the cobblestones. Heller, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd, pushed his way through the dancers, his earlier paralysis replaced by a surge of furious adrenaline. He knelt beside the boy, turning him over. The boy's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the sky. A grotesque, fixed smile was plastered on his face. Heller pressed his fingers to the boy's neck. There was no pulse. He pressed his ear to his chest. There was no sound. The heart had simply given out, burst from the strain. The music barely paused. A few people screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the drums and pipes. The dancers simply shuffled around the body, their own trance unbroken. High above on the main stage, Father Christoph, who had been observing his handiwork, saw the commotion. He raised a hand, not to stop the music, but to command the crowd's attention. He made the sign of the cross over the fallen boy. "A blessed release!" Christoph's voice boomed, filled with a terrible, triumphant piety. "His penance is paid. His soul is with God." And the crowd, a beast with 1,000 heads, roared its approval. They cheered for the boy's death. They cheered for the cure that had killed him. Heller looked up from the dead body at his feet to the face of the priest on the stage. In that moment, something inside him shattered. The cool, detached physician was gone, burned away by a white-hot rage. This was no longer a debate between science and superstition. This was not a matter of conflicting theories. This was murder by ideology, and he had just witnessed it. Rage is a powerful fuel. For Dr. Anton Heller, it burned away the last vestiges of his scientific detachment, leaving behind a core of diamond-hard certainty. His study, once a sanctuary of reason, was now the epicenter of a storm. Books lay splayed open on the floor, their spines broken. Pages torn from ancient texts were scattered across his desk, covered in frantic, angry scrawls. The place smelled of stale sweat and fury. He paced before his terrified apprentice Lucas, not as a teacher, but as a prophet of a new and terrible gospel. "Don't you see, Lucas?" he said, his voice raw. "I was a fool. I was looking for a poison in their bread when the poison was in the story they were being told. It's in their minds." He grabbed a medical chart depicting the nervous system, the delicate web of lines now seeming laughably inadequate. A belief so strong, so drenched in fear, that it seizes control of the body. The mind tells the limbs to dance, and they obey. It's a psychogenic storm. "But how does it spread, Doctor?" Lucas stammered. "Christoph." Heller spat the name like a curse. "He is the vector. He isn't curing them. He's feeding the delusion. He gives them a stage, and they feel seen. He gives them music, and their madness finds a rhythm. He tells them their sickness is holy, and their suffering becomes a virtue. Every beat of the drum, every cheer from the crowd, creates a feedback loop of hysteria, reinforcing the belief, making the sickness stronger. It's a fire, and he is dousing it with oil." Heller stopped pacing and stared at his own hands, the hands of a physician, now useless. "I cannot fight this with medicine. You can't bleed a belief. You can't prescribe a tonic for mass delusion. To stop this, I have to kill the idea itself." He looked up, and the wildness in his eyes had cooled into something far more dangerous. A plan. He was no longer a physician. He was a strategist in a war for the soul of Strasbourg. That night, Heller became a creature of the shadows. The city's main square was a Hieronymus Bosch painting brought to life. Hundreds of bodies writhed under the torchlight, a sea of motion lit by the hellish orange glow. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and the relentless pounding rhythm of the musicians on the stage. Heller moved along the edge of the square, his face hidden by a dark hood, his eyes scanning the dancers for a weakness in the herd. He found it in the form of a young girl, no older than 12. Her movements were becoming sluggish, her face pale with exhaustion. He saw a flicker of individuality in her eyes, a glimmer of the person trapped inside the convulsive shell. This was his chance. He darted into the crowd, grabbing the girl's arm. She was terrifyingly light. He dragged her away from the stage, pulling her into the relative quiet of a narrow alleyway. He held her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Your name is Greta. Your father is a baker. He weeps for you every night. This is not God, Greta. This is a sickness. You have to fight it." For one breathtaking moment, it worked. The girl's eyes, previously wide and unfocused, blinked, a flicker of recognition. "Doctor Heller?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She stumbled, her legs threatening to give way. The frantic dance had stopped. Hope surged through Heller. His theory was right. The trance could be broken, but the system fought back. Two burly city guards, their uniforms bearing the crest of the council, loomed over them. "What is this?" one of them growled. "Step away from the child, Doctor." "She needs rest," Heller pleaded. "She will die if she keeps going." "She is a penitent," the second guard said, his face a mask of pious certainty. "Father Christoph has forbidden anyone from interfering with their holy work. Leave her alone." They seized Heller, their powerful hands gripping his arms. They were not arresting a physician. They were silencing a heretic. With a grunt, they threw him to the ground. Heller watched in horror as Greta, her brief moment of clarity gone, was gently but firmly guided back towards the stage. As the music washed over her once more, her limbs began to jerk, and she was lost again, swallowed by the frenzied, pulsating crowd. Reason had won for a single heartbeat, only to be beaten down and crushed by the brute force of the superstition it sought to cure. Heller knew then that he could not fight this alone. He needed allies. He found them 2 nights later, in the cold, cavernous space of an abandoned riverside warehouse. The air smelled of damp stone and rat droppings. He met with a small, secret group of 5 men merchants and minor guild members, their faces etched with grief and anger. They were not scientists or philosophers. They were fathers and husbands who had lost loved ones to Christoph's deadly cure. "He is killing them," said a textile merchant named Klaus, his voice breaking. His own wife was among the dancers. "We see it. We know it. But the council is bewitched by him. And the crowd, they call him a living saint. If we speak out, we will be branded heretics. Our businesses will be ruined, our families shunned." Heller stood before them, no longer the outcast doctor, but the leader of a nascent resistance. "Then we will not speak out. We will act," he said, his voice resonating with newfound authority. "Your reason is useless against a mob. We cannot shout louder than their music. We cannot break their faith with logic." He leaned over a crate, his hands flat on the dusty wood. "So, we will give them a different song to sing. We will use the priest's own tools against him. We will fight spectacle with spectacle. We need to create a moment so powerful, so undeniable, that it shatters the delusion for everyone at once. And for that," he said, looking at the wealthy merchants, "I will need your resources." To defeat an idea, Heller had a desperate plan. But to defeat a man, he needed to understand him. He sent Lucas, his loyal, terrified apprentice, on the most dangerous mission of all, to watch Father Christoph. That night, Lucas slipped into the back of the great, vaulted cathedral, a ghost in the flickering candlelight. He watched as Christoph dismissed his acolytes and walked alone, not to the main altar, but to a small, private side chapel. Lucas followed, his heart pounding, hiding behind a stone pillar. He expected to see the priest kneeling in prayer, perhaps reveling in his power. But what he saw stopped his breath. Father Christoph was not praying. He was standing before a small, simple wooden altar, upon which sat a single, crudely made doll woven from dried corn husks. The priest's broad shoulders were shaking. He stared at the doll, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the altar. There was no triumph on his face, only a profound, bottomless grief. He was weeping. Elise, Christophe whispered, the name a shattered, broken thing in the sacred silence. I tried a different way. It has to work this time, it has to. And in that moment, Lucas understood everything. The fanaticism, the absolute certainty, the desperate, deadly cure. It wasn't born of a cynical lust for power. Christophe's own sister, Elise, had died years ago in his home village, seized by the very same dancing fit. He wasn't a monster. He was a man consumed by a past failure, desperately and tragically reenacting a half-remembered folk ritual in a city-sized attempt to save his sister's ghost. He was the truest believer of them all, a man whose entire crusade was built upon a foundation of personal trauma and a desperate, superstitious need to believe that chaos could be controlled. The sun beat down on the cathedral square, baking the mud and stone and the hundreds of sweating bodies that filled it. It was the climax of the city's madness. Father Christophe, his face a mask of ecstatic purpose, led a great, shambling procession toward the holy sanctuary. At his back were the dancers, hundreds of them, their movements now slow and ragged, their bodies little more than animated skeletons. Many were on the verge of collapse, held upright only by the press of the crowd and the sheer, unthinking momentum of the mass hysteria. Behind them, and lining every street and rooftop, thousands more citizens watched, their faces a mixture of pious awe and morbid terror. It was a vision of hell, a pilgrimage of the damned. From a second-story balcony overlooking the square, Dr. Anton Heller watched the scene, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Beside him stood the merchant Klaus and two of the other men who had funded his desperate gambit. Below them, the procession reached the base of the great cathedral steps. Christophe broke from the front of the crowd and ascended the steps alone, turning to face the city. He raised his arms, a messianic figure ready to deliver the final act of his deadly ritual. This was the moment. Heller gave a sharp, single nod to Klaus. As Christophe opened his mouth to begin his final booming prayer, a new sound cut through the air. It came from the balcony where Heller stood. A troupe of musicians and singers, secretly hired and hidden, stepped forward. But they did not play the frantic, pounding rhythms that had fueled the plague. Instead, a harmony of harps and flutes rose, playing a melody that was somber, beautiful, and heartbreakingly calm. Actors dressed in the white and gold robes of saints and angels appeared beside them, their faces pictures of serene sorrow. Then, Heller raised a strange device to his lips, a long, conical horn of polished tin, a speaking trumpet designed to amplify his voice over the din. He did not speak of medicine. He did not speak of psychogenic illness. He surrendered his own language and chose to speak in theirs. People of Strasbourg, his magnified voice boomed, imbued with a strange, sorrowful authority. Hear your saints. They weep for you. See the tears of the angels for their suffering children. The crowd below stirred, confused. The new, gentle music was a balm and a shock, directly at odds with the frantic drumming that still echoed from other parts of the city. The trial is over, Heller declared, his voice ringing with conviction. Your penance has been heard. Your suffering has reached the heavens. But now God asks not for frenzy, he calls for rest, he asks for peace, the fever has broken, let there be silence. He was not debunking their belief. He was giving it a new chapter. He was providing a divine command to end the madness, an exit from the feedback loop. He was fighting a story with a better story. The effect was immediate. The crowd, caught between two conflicting divine messages, hesitated. The dancers, their bodies and minds tethered to the rhythm of the city's mania, faltered. The frantic music from the official stages suddenly seemed harsh and profane next to the ethereal melody coming from the balcony. The single, unified rhythm that had held them all captive was broken. Blasphemer! Christophe shrieked from the cathedral steps, his face contorted with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Heller. "That is a devil's trick. Do not listen." But his authority was fractured. The crowd was no longer his to command. They looked from the weeping angels on the balcony to the raging priest on the steps. And for the first time in days, they were uncertain. Heller seized the moment. He strode to the front of the balcony, his speaking trumpet discarded, and his voice, now his own, cut through the relative quiet. He did not address the crowd, but spoke directly to the priest, his words a surgeon's scalpel aimed at the heart of the man's conviction. "This isn't for them, is it, Christoph?" Heller called out, his voice clear and sharp. "This was never about their sins. This is for your sister. This is for Elise." The name, spoken into the open air, seemed to suck the very sound from the square. Christoph froze as if struck by lightning. "You think this spectacle will save them?" Heller continued, his voice softening with a terrible pity. "You think this frenzy will appease the God that took her? It won't save them, Christoph, just as it couldn't save her." It was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis of a soul. The words pierced the priestess armor of righteousness and struck the grieving, traumatized brother beneath. The fanaticism in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a wave of raw, unendurable agony. The strength went out of his legs, and he collapsed onto the cathedral steps, a broken man whose desperate, city-sized ritual had failed just as surely as the small village one had years before. His conviction, the engine of the entire plague, had shattered, and in its absence, the madness began to recede. Days later, a profound quiet had settled over Strasbourg. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of a city waking from a long and terrible fever. The stages were gone, dismantled plank by plank. The music had long since faded. On the streets, small groups of dazed, gaunt survivors were being gently led home by their families, their bodies still, their eyes slowly regaining the light of true consciousness. Dr. Heller walked through the city, the unfamiliar peace a strange weight on his shoulders. He felt no triumph, only a deep and abiding weariness. As he passed the cathedral, he saw Father Christoph. Stripped of his titles and his authority, he was sweeping the stone steps, his movements slow and mechanical. Their eyes met for a long moment across the empty square. There was no anger between them, no victory or defeat. There was only a shared, sad understanding of the terrible fragility of the human mind. Lucas came to stand beside him. "You did it, Doctor," the apprentice said, his voice full of awe. "You saved them." Heller watched a woman gently place a blanket over the shoulders of her son, who sat staring blankly at the space where the stage had been. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know what I did, Lucas," he said, his voice quiet. "I found no cure. I offered no medicine." He turned his gaze from the broken priest to the recovering city. "I just gave them a different story to believe." What a fascinating and unsettling story. On the surface, it's about a bizarre historical event, but the real heart of the tale is the battle between two very different kinds of power. You have Dr. Heller, with the power of reason and the scientific method. He's looking for a physical cause poison, a pathogen, something he can measure and fight. Then you have Father Christoph, who wields the power of belief. He understands that in a time of terror, people don't just want a diagnosis. They want a story that gives their suffering meaning. And for a while, his story is more powerful. What is so compelling is that science, for all its rigor, initially fails. It offers no immediate comfort and no clear plan. It's the priest's emotionally satisfying but deadly narrative that the city chooses to believe. The turning point only comes when Heller realizes he can just be a scientist. He has to become a storyteller himself. He doesn't defeat superstition with facts. He defeats it by co-opting its language, offering a better, safer story for people to cling to. It leaves you wondering about the stories we choose to believe today when we're faced with things we can't explain. So, here is my question for you. In a moment of crisis, when the scientific explanation is complex and unsatisfying, how tempting is it to embrace a simpler, more powerful story, even if it might be wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.